Hey, Gareth, how are you?
Hi Mark, you're right.
So,
How are you doing?
I'm not too bad at all. Can you do the audio description intro? I would get that one out of the way, and you'll describe to people who you are and what you look like.
So yeah, I'm Gareth-Ford Williams. I'm one of the heads of UX design, responsibility for accessibility at the BBC. Been there 15 years. Well, in this role in 15 years, I joined to make TV trails, and like so many other people, that you end up in accessibility because you end up having conversations about it. 50 something, yeah, white, balding northerner with 2001 t-shirt. Sat like probably most other people in a bedroom.
So I just want to check in on the balding. At what point do you and I become bald and not balding?
I think
where's that line?
between us, we could probably muster up a full head of hair.
Okay, maybe
at a push.
So the reason we're kicking off with this conversation, I think, is because certainly in terms of the work you've done in the BBC over that 15 years, obviously not all in that one part, but I think that what we're trying to do in this session this morning is talk about how change happens within big organisations. Obviously, lots of people in the conference will be from smaller organisations and have lots of different challenges in a day-to-day basis in terms of shifting the dial on accessibility. But if we take the top level view, how would you describe the shift over the last few years in the BBC in terms of accessibility? Where would you say you are in terms of a journey?
It's one of those. I think there's a little bit of thing about accessibility. There's a fair amount of questing and holy grail about it because things continuously change. You know, I always say my life would be really, really easy if people stopped inventing things, and that's this whole thing. It's a progressive area to work in, and you constantly are asking questions and trying to find interesting answers to to really curious problems, and it's all about people. But I think I kind of slightly privileged with the BBC because I used to make TV trails up to about 2004, but the BBC's got a massively long history of accessibility anyway. With its first Envision signing, and our signer here, they did that first time in 1957 for the news. They did a news program at the weekend, News for the Deaf, and that's started and first closed caption service in the world in the 1970s with our CFAX captions, and it's always thought about, it's trying to reach as many people because it's in its charter. And when I kind of raised the question 15 years ago with a chap called Tony Aggie, who was the controller of bbc.co.uk, and my boss, who is Tim Davey, who's curiously in the last couple of months has just become the Director General. It was like, why aren't we doing this? We should be doing this. And and there were pockets of bits and pieces. There was a chap called Ian Hamilton that was doing some children's games in CBeebies for Switch users, and there were bits and pieces, but there was no consolidated effort. And by that time already, it was a huge scale. And that is one of the kind of the things that we're always tackling about is scale and complexity and diversity of audience, and constantly and trying to make this scale. I think the conversation's always moving on. Jamie's talked about the stuff that we've done in VR, and there's a wider, sort of XR output of it. And, Jamie did that project because we couldn't find any reliable data about the barriers in VR. And so we need to know that. We can't start creating solutions until we know what the questions are.
Yeah.
And so it's this constant thing. And so this, we're never going to crack the problem, but we're constantly tackling it, and we're constantly thinking about it. And I found this, you asked me this, I ended up getting a little bit sentimental and started thinking back 15 years about where we came from, and then realized that was actually a really bad idea because it was, oh no, stress. That's awful. And that was my first point of contact with AbilityNet, as that was the time I met this chap. I was told to go and meet this chap called Robin Christopherson, and we invited Robin in. We did the first session, workshop session on accessibility, 2005 with Robin. And I think then I think Robin's a bit of a sci-fi nerd. I think we went off into Television Centre and found a TARDIS afterwards, a real one. High point of the day. But it was, it's a constant challenge, and various things. I mean, we've made so many mistakes, but there was no precedent for lots of the stuff that we've been trying. And I think the BBC started out as a research and development company. It created a radio network because there was no such thing as a radio network, to then become a corporation to put programs on. And so we had this kind of R&D approach. It kind of sat within the kind of the ethos, the ethics, the culture of the organization is to experiment. And we made a lot of mistakes in 15 years, and we've done some good things, and we're continuing in the same vein, really.
So just the starting bit, I'm thinking about how we're placing this for people. I think what we're seeing in TechShare Pro and around us in the communities that we're both part of is there's obviously a groundswell of interest in accessibility in the broader sense. There's the core accessibility evangelists, if you like, who probably recognise each other to some extent from the sorts of events they go to, the sorts of things that catch their eye. There's the champions. We'll come to champions in a minute because you've been doing a lot of work around that, the growing network. And then there's the allies, the people who sort of get what you're talking about, just want to know how they can help. But there's a stage in everybody's journey, I guess, around that initial empathy. That's what made me think about Robin's role in there. Presumably there's a point when everybody has to go, okay, I get why I'm doing this now, sort of understand its purpose or something. Does that still remain? Do we still need to keep showing people, somebody using voiceover, Addy does that, Robin explaining the power of the technology in his life. Do we still need to keep telling those stories? Do you think that's a powerful part of it?
We do, and I think there's a lot of it is actually to blame. You can blame the education system. Right. I think really quite considerably in the 1970s and 60s and 80s. There was segregation of children, and there weren't disabled kids in mainstream schools until I think we just started having VI kids just as I was coming towards the end of school in the late 1980s, and so people grew up without knowing people. And that's a big problem, and it's getting people to just go, right, it's just people, and we have a different way of interfacing with the world, and we have different needs and different requirements. And, if you separate people out, empathy is hard. And now people, it's great. I mean, the BBC's got about 8+, I can't remember the actual percentage of members of staff. It's trying to get to 12% members of staff with disabilities at the minute. There's a huge push. And it's really, really important. It's really important that we're all in the same spaces and we're all together and we all understand each other, because then there doesn't become any problem, around empathy. We all understand exactly. And it's kind of, I'm finding younger generations are having a lot less of a problem with it than our generation, who struggle a little bit. They get it, we're fine. And I suppose when we got to the exec, though, I think it was an interesting one going back 15 years when we got to the exec. Actually, the question was, why the hell aren't we doing this? No one wanted to know why we should be doing it. They wanted to know why it wasn't happening already. Right. Which became a massive problem because everyone became a huge enthusiast, and then we had to deal with it all.
Countless requests to do stuff.
Fix it all now, and it's like, no, that's not possible. But we can pull stuff to start pulling things together.
I'm interested in that, and I think that's interesting in the sense that one of the bits that people watching may pick out from this, I think, and it happened in a couple of other sessions we've talked about, and I know it's going to come out later, is the idea that you can actually go and talk to people at the top. You don't have to go necessarily via all the established routes, and that there's a case to be made here which is pretty straightforward, that people with any with an open door should be listening to, at the top, whatever the top means, whoever that is. Certainly, we were bowled over on Tuesday having someone like Cindy Rose from Microsoft, Mark Reed from WPP, Lena from Unilever. They're saying that we want to do this. It is established now that that's the thing to do. So you can imagine somebody, gritting their teeth and getting into the chief executive officer and saying, look, I think this is really important. I think we should do it. Is the gap actually somewhere in between the two? It's the day-to-day practice. How do you shift? Because that's a slow process, isn't it? You can change the mind of the CEO tomorrow, like you say, and they come back with a long list of things they want you to do, and then you turn to the team that's meant to be doing it, and they're saying, we don't know what you're talking about. We don't know how to do it, even if they're as motivated as they could be. But I think that stuff you've been tackling in the BBC is changing the way you do things rather than just winning the case is the next step,
I think
isn't it?
It's building that case and building something that is easy, understandable, and scalable and sustainable. And you don't want to end up in, sort of what's the best way of describing it? Auditing sausage machine. I think is it's not about compliance; it's about people. And and you need to bring that in. And one of the first things I did is got permission to send out a division wide, and we all used to be pretty much in White City in those days. We're spread out all over the country now, but send out a division wide email and just say, look, I'm going to be in the boardroom this one lunchtime with a load of sandwiches and tea, and with no friends. And so you can either come and talk to me because you feel sorry for me, or if you're interested in accessibility, I'd love to have a chat. And it was packed. It was absolutely hammered. We couldn't fit everyone in the room, and it wasn't just the sandwiches, because BBC sandwiches aren't that great. But the people turned up. They wanted to know about it, and this became that first network. And in that network, I went to them and said, "Okay, I need to understand how you do your job, and I need to make sure that this works for you. I'm not going to tell you how to do your job. I'm not going to slap a load of guidelines in front of you and thou shalt not in cross stitch over the bed. It's none of that. It was just, I have to use, as an accessibility manager, I had to understand how to integrate something along the lines of guidelines, which frankly are quite unusable. They're very, very hard to use, but it's find a way of integrating those in and doing it gradually and playing a really long game with it. I think of that group, the first thing we did was to create subgroups to tackle each of the different questions that we were raising within the group. And the first thing we looked at was semantic structure, and we got a big group of people across all the teams together, and we all decided how many heading level 1s we were going to have. Because we couldn't find any pages that were marked up the same. So we just tackled one problem. We did it slowly and gradually. The business treats headings exactly the same everywhere now, and no one really knows why. And that's because we sorted it out 15 years ago, and it just became the way that we did it.
Yeah.
And that's it. That's that trick, is turning accessibility into not building things and making them accessible, but building accessible things, because that's the way we do it.
Yeah.
And it takes time, and you have to listen. You have to be a good listener to be an accessibility person. And yes, seek forgiveness, not approval. Just go and knock on the CEO's door and have a chat. Find out when they get in the lift, pop in with them and have a natter. Do that. Be cheeky. No one's going to have a go at you for talking about something that's very important, very ethical, and really, in some ways shouldn't be discussed at that. About why we should do it. It just should be done.
Just picking up on one thing, then I know that you worked on the iPlayer.
That's where it all started.
I was wondering whether if I was sitting inside an organisation, maybe not as big as the BBC, but maybe more typical, particularly if it's a digital company, for example, with lots of products around it, is it good to pick a project to go at? Is that a top tip that you would, if you were mentoring somebody, say pick something that people are going to see the change in it, rather than try and spread it thinly across everything? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's kind of where it went. So Tony Aggie, who was the controller of .co.uk at the time, and he just said to me, "Look, we've got this project over here. It wasn't called iPlayer in those days, and it was a prototype called BBC Imp." And he said, "We're trying to build a thing, and it's still fine." He said, "Just get in there, write a bunch of requirements, and I'll mandate them up front. We're just going to experiment. We don't even know if this is going to happen, and let's find a place. Let's find out how it works, test it, make sure it works, and then spread it." And then we've got a place where we can say, look, it's working over here. Here's how we did it. It's quite simple. Here's some documentation that will help you, build bits and pieces, and you spread it out from there. And we ended up building a small team off the back of it. Lucy Policino, Andrew Strachan, and Kevin Carey, who was before he became chairman of the RNIB, he was actually an engineer on that team.
Yeah.
And so we built it, and it became part of iPlayer's culture, and it stayed. There's no accessibility. There's actually an accessibility lead in iPlayer, but it just became part of the thing that's what iPlayer is to be as accessible as it possibly can. And then that just kind of spread out. We just learned it, and it became a nice place to experiment. But bear in mind, already by then, BBC had millions of web pages. It was huge already by 2005. It's now absolutely ridiculous size, but it was It's that kind of thing. You can't try and go for everything. It's not possible.
Yeah. Well, I think so.
Or prove me wrong. There's the challenge.
I'm gonna draw us to close. I think that the thing that I think that's a really good place to stop, because the next bit we're going to hear from, of course, is Charlie picking up a role within the BBC about champions. I don't actually know how far back the story goes from the point of view of BBC and that champions thing. You mentioned that initial session at White City with people joining in. At what point did it formalise? At what point did you feel it became necessary to put a label or a name on it? I mean, is it in people's job descriptions
it was
and
just
so on?
groups. It was just an accessibility group, and it became, we looked at different things. It was like interest groups within the BBC, and people volunteered their time, and they just wanted to sort it out, and it kind of evolved out that idea. And then I think somewhere around about 2011, 2012, we were chatting with someone who just said, there's champions networks in places like Yahoo, but there was no such thing as an accessibility champions network out there, and we kind of formalized it off that.
Right.
The groups had kind of settled down by then, and they weren't really active, and we got on top of stuff, and we were building the mobile accessibility guidelines. There was 2012 Olympics being done at the time, and that's where we ended up with one chap who approached us and just said, I want to know everything. Who had been in part of those original groups and part of those HTML, and he just wanted to know even more. And Henny Swan, who was a part of the team at the time, teamed up with him, and it's called Al Duggan, and he became kind of like our first official champion by name, and then it just grew, and and it's still trying to find it. In some ways, the successes, the failures, it's still trying to find its feet and trying to understand what a network should be, which is what I'm not going to talk about, what Charlie's going to talk about.
Yeah.
But it kind of, it's always been there, but officially about 8 years.
Yeah. Well, I think that's interesting, particularly as a link into the next thing, because I think certainly my impression, maybe a couple of years when I first came across the idea, was that there was a fixed model of some kind for a Champions Network. It's quite clear there isn't, and I don't think it's meant as entirely as a compliment that you've been making it up as you go along the whole time, and I think that's probably the best point to finish the conversation.
Don't tell anyone.
No, I haven't. Honestly, totally. I've not mentioned that to anybody at all. Gareth, it's fantastic to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks,
and also for all the amazing work that you've been doing, and inspiring us all along the way. So thank you.
It's all to do with everyone else. I'm just the person that tries to give some shape to it. There's an army of people.
You've got a particularly good way of doing it. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.